All right, good morning, everyone. Hello and welcome to our Prevention Matters panel session on Housing First for Youth. My name is Steph Vasco and I'm the Director of Communications at the COH, and I'll be your moderator today. For those of you joining us for the first time, Prevention Matters is our monthly panel series where we bring together leaders and experts to explore one core idea. How do we sustainably prevent homelessness? The series explores everything from emerging prevention research and best practices to proven program models and the policy and practice conditions needed to scale them in the real world. Backed by strong evidence that prevention must be an integral part of any homelessness strategy and that the current and growing homelessness crisis cannot be solved without it, we created the series to equip service providers, policymakers, governments, funders, and researchers with the knowledge and tools needed to implement and scale prevention across their communities. But importantly, before we get into today's session, I'd like to first pay respect to the traditional guardians of the land where many of us are calling in from today. So at the COH, we recognize the long-standing and ongoing relationship that Indigenous peoples have with Turtle Island, which includes both ceded and traditional land, and also includes the land known as Canada. Because we're based at York University in Toronto, we acknowledge our presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Toronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nations, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. And if you're unfamiliar with the territories, languages, and treaties of the land you're calling in from, we invite you to take a moment to learn more. Lindsay will be sharing the digital native land map tool in the chat where you can find your location and explore the information in more detail. We are so grateful that we are able to gather virtually on this land today to explore an important topic, preventing youth homelessness using the Housing First for Youth program model. So some notes about today's session, some housekeeping. Part of what makes these Prevention Matters panel sessions so valuable is the two-way dialogue. We really encourage you to share any reflections or ideas that resonate with you in the chat throughout the panel session. We also know that many of you have questions for our experts here today, so we'll be hosting a Q&A at the very end of the discussion, but we'll also be taking questions throughout. So we encourage you to ask any questions in the question box down below as they come up for you during the conversation. And as always, we encourage you to keep the conversation and questions kind. We'll be recording today's session and we'll send it along to everyone that's registered, along with any resources that are mentioned in the discussion today. All right, let's get into it. So many of you are here with us in the audience today because you're either doing Housing First for Youth work already, thinking about bringing it to your community, or trying to better understand what it actually takes to do this model well. That is at the heart of today's conversation. What has to be done what has to be understood about the Housing First for Youth program model, and what has to be in place on the ground for Housing First for Youth to be successful. And these questions have become especially important over the last few years because we've seen Housing First for Youth rolled out in organizations and communities, not just in Canada, but across the globe. And what we've seen from this rollout is that the effectiveness of Housing First for Youth is largely, if not entirely, dependent on how it is executed on the ground. And this is a really important piece to understand. For anyone doing Housing First for Youth work or thinking about doing Housing First for Youth work, it's critical to understand what this model requires in practice to be successful and why it requires those things. We know from our Making the Shift research and real-world testing in Housing First for Youth demonstration sites across the country with real youth and real organizations that the model works when it's executed as intended. And so it's critical that organizations and communities have a really clear understanding of why those demonstration programs were successful and what conditions and practices need to be in place on the ground for that success to be replicated. And so today we have two Housing First for Youth experts with us. Stephen Gaetz from the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, and Heidi Walter from Away Home Canada. They are the authors of the Housing First for Youth Program Model Guide and Operations Manual, and they're here to help us talk through what it really takes to implement Housing First for Youth. And then, of course, we're going to open up the floor to questions for you at the end. So we'll get into our discussion here. Let me just bring up Heidi and Steve. Hello, both of you. Let's see here.
Morning.
Good morning. You may have lost Steve for a second there. He's been having Wi-Fi issues at home, but we've got Heidi, and Steve should be rejoining us any moment.
That's okay. I'll pretend that I know what he was gonna say, and then I'll just say
Feel free.
this is what
Uh,
Steve thinks.
Great. Perfect, Heidi. That's why we have you here. So I guess to get us started then, Heidi, can you tell us a bit about Housing First for Youth became Housing First for Youth? How did it get to where we are today?
Yeah, absolutely. So, taking you all the way back to 2009 in Calgary, Alberta. There was a government that was in place at that time that was really quite progressive and wanted to focus on the ending and preventing of homelessness in general. Through that came also wanting to understand youth homelessness because at that time, Calgary as a city had three youth shelters, which was quite a lot for the size of Calgary at that time. And so we wanted to think about what that was looking like. And I had a colleague who actually went to a meeting and she came back from that meeting and it was about housing first and it was about Samson Barris's model and how it was really taking off in the United States and in other parts of Canada. And this colleague Kim was like, what would it look like for this to look like for young people? Because there was some pieces that weren't really necessarily a fit. The core ingredients, the five core principles were absolutely the same, but what did that need to look like when we were starting to think about young people? And so at the same time in Calgary, Boys and Girls Clubs of Calgary, across the country, there was a man by the name of Dr. Stephen Gaetz, who was also focusing on prevention of youth homelessness. Oh, oh no, sorry. I thought I heard something. Yeah, he was focusing on youth homelessness and really I don't know if he would say this, but making sure that his career and his pathway was about the prevention of youth homelessness. And so we learned from him, he learned from us, and we kind of became married at that point, really thinking about what what housing first for youth would look like. And it kind of was born there. So the first program of its kind was the Infinity Project, still exists today, triple the size that it was back in 2010 when it opened its doors. And I'm really fortunate that that's kind of where I started my Housing First for Youth career, was learning with boots on the ground from Steve and all of my colleagues, trying to figure out what this needed to look like. Super frustrating, lots of change management pieces. But yeah, it was really interesting. Steph, I shared a slide with you around housing first and also housing first for youth, like the differences, just as a visual for folks to be able to see. Just because, and I don't need to go through it by any means, but really, what I love about Housing First and Housing First for Youth is because there was lots of consultation with Sam around Housing First and then with Steve around what Housing First for Youth should look like. And so you can see that the core principles still stayed the same. But the work looked differently. We all believe that housing is a human right. We all believe that individuals should have social inclusion and more non-paid professionals in their life than they do paid professionals, and that community integration and that opportunities for education and employment are important, but the work inside those five core principles really look differently. I don't know if Steve's back or not, if he has anything to add to that.
Don't see him here just yet.
It's okay.
Oh, good. We've got this, Heidi. All right. And I guess just to follow up on that a little bit, you know, when does someone's program become Housing First for Youth? And can you tell us a bit about when it's maybe not Housing First for Youth?
Yeah, that it's a tricky question that takes it takes a little bit of processing, and that's why I think I love my role of being able to go and spend time with lots of folks that are on this call today. So it's nice to see some familiar faces about being able to go and spend time in their programs to kind of take apart that piece and have really great conversations around it. I think the thing for me is kind of like some of our non-negotiables. And so Steph, I know
Mm-hmm.
I just said not to use, I wasn't going to use a lot of slides, but
Good.
since
That's why they're here.
that is the topic, it kind of would be great to talk about those non-negotiables. You know, Housing First for Youth is flexible. Housing First for Youth is very individualized. Housing First for Youth takes every young person's situation, culture, community, their context, where they're coming from, where they've been, and what supports they need, into very individualized roles. But what we want to make sure that Housing First for Youth has is these areas, right? We want to make sure that we're doing home visits. And for some of you, this is going to be repetitive because you've heard me say this, but home visits, not about like, is there holes in the wall? But more about how are young people settling in? How are young people, creating a home environment for themselves? Are they learning to be good neighbors? Are they talking to their neighbors? And when they're in the hallways, do they say good morning, when they're getting the mail to those individuals? And making sure that they have the life skills, the proper life skills to do home visits. Of course, paying rent. I know lots of you have probably read through Housing First and Housing First for Youth that young people and adults should be paying 30% of their income towards rent. And I really believe that we should probably look at reevaluating that and putting some different context to it, because I don't think there's anybody on this call that is only paying 30% of their wage to rent anymore, just because of the economy and what the world looks like. And so that I think is something that's important, but making sure that young people are contributing something so they start to get a feel for what that is. Rental subsidies. I'm going to give a shout out to Ottawa for anybody that's on the call right now. For Ottawa, if you are somebody in another community that does this, but I really love Ottawa for their portable rent subs. And what I know about, like, what I love about that is that when a young person receives a rental subsidy, it's portable, meaning that it goes with them. So once their journey is done with a Housing First for Youth program, they can continue to get that rent sub because it's ran through the city. And so it doesn't necessarily need to be connected to Housing First or program expectations. Standard lease. This sounds simple, but in my time in Housing First for Youth, I can't tell you how many times young people showed up with a lease that was like on a scrap piece of paper. I once met a young person in a Denny's and they showed me a lease on a napkin and said that they gave somebody a $200 deposit. And so it breaks my heart. But a standard lease, we want young people to recognize what we would sign is something that we want them to be signing. Caseload sizes, this always gets people, but it is real and it is true. And we've tested it. And Steve knows that we've tested all different kinds of numbers in the last 15 plus years. But the caseload ratio needs to be 7 to 10. If you're over that, I'm just not sure how you're doing the proper work that's expected within Housing First for Youth. And then lastly, no discharge to homelessness. Young people are going to make mistakes. Young people are going to take chances. They're going to have to learn. But if they get evicted because of guest management or because of late payer to rent or, damages into the home and they have to go access emergency shelter or if they go to couch surfing, we just want to make sure that we show up again the next day and say what needs to look differently. So, if a young person does find themselves in emergency supports again, it's just about our case management still continuing. So, we don't want young people to feel like just because they lost their housing that they lost all of the supports. And so that's what that one really means. Oh, Laura, that's a really great question. I mean,
Yeah,
Steph, is that okay if I
feel
answer
free.
that? Because it
That's
kind of
perfect.
fits right
It
now.
goes right
Um,
in.
so Laura, I hear what you're saying. One of the things, and I don't necessarily disagree with you, but if you're thinking about in the youth world, right, and Steve can speak a lot to the data and the research that we've been collecting for the last 8 years. Housing First for Youth is very much an intensive intervention in the youth stream. And so it does seem more downstream where like, if this was a call on family natural supports or upstream or reconnect or some of those other prevention programs, they are much farther upstream, if you will. What I like to think about Housing First for Youth is kind of, and I don't want to put all this weight on people's shoulders, but Housing First for Youth is kind of the last stop for young people before they enter the adult sector. And what we've learned from young people throughout the research is that they don't want to go into the adult sector. They're scared. The adult sector doesn't hold their hands like they want it to and what they're accustomed to. And so we want a young person's experience with homelessness to end before they have to access the adult shelters, or sorry, the adult Housing First programs. There's going to be obviously there's going to be some times that young people will need ongoing physical supports or mental health supports, those kinds of things. But Housing First for Youth, the government and we see it, and lots of communities see it as still a prevention, but one of the downstream preventions in the youth. That's why we want to make sure that we've solved this issue of homelessness for young people before the age of 25. Go for it, Steve.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think we need to go back to how we define prevention. So our definition of prevention of homelessness is based on the public health model of prevention, which has primary, secondary, and tertiary. So primary prevention in health would mean things like vaccinations, like working way upstream. And for youth uh, at risk of or experiencing homelessness, it could be school-based early intervention, upstream things like that. It could be designing housing first for youth to work with young people exiting care or who are running away from care, that kind of thing. Secondary prevention is to make sure that whatever health issue or condition is there doesn't get worse. So you stop it, right? And so that would be like if we had effective shelter diversion programs, that kind of thing. And then tertiary prevention, this is where Housing First for Youth and Housing First fits in, is if you have a health condition, what can we do to make sure it doesn't recur? And so Housing First for Youth fits in that type, that is a tertiary form of prevention in that it's designed to help people exit homelessness, and with the proper supports, it will make sure that the young person doesn't re-enter homelessness. So it's actually a very critical point of prevention. Where with our response to homelessness, we tend to like always want to narrow in on one thing, like the crisis response and that kind of thing, rather than think about the spectrum. Where are the uh, inflection points where a preventive intervention is going to really help a young person? And that's anywhere along their pathway towards, into, during, after they've been homeless. But we can, I mentioned Housing First for Youth Leaving Care. There, that's one that we did some experimenting with in Toronto during our Making the Shift project. And that's a great idea, right? Like So if you take the core principles as key, that's the engine that drives it all, and provide people with
Mhm.
housing and supports, and it has to be together. You can apply it in all kinds of situations for subpopulations.
Mhm.
Um, Now it looks different for depending on the age of a person, right? Because particularly in terms of like the housing options, a 16-year-old, it may not be the best idea that they move into scattered site housing. Some young people might thrive, but other people, for developmental reasons, may not be ready for that kind of thing. So, but we modify the model and adapt to the needs of that particular person. Um, and that's one of the key ingredients of it is the flexibility of it to really meet the needs of young people, just like you would want any young person to have the kind of supports where, there are meaningful adults who are helping them.
Mhm.
That's great, Steve. And I think people joining us today who are maybe thinking about implementing Housing First for Youth in their communities, they might be wondering, what level of adaptation is okay for
Well,
their community.
it's a very good question. And so clearly you have to implement a program and adapt it to your local ecosystem, like what's in place. There's a big difference between being in a small town in northern Alberta and being in
Mhm.
Toronto. So you have to do that. But there are some key things like Heidi went through non-negotiables. Um, I think the other key thing is it really has to follow the core principles. When we
Mhm.
developed Housing First for Youth, we put in a huge effort to get that right. Like, what are the core principles that drive the program model and the service delivery? Don't mess around with that. Don't have a housing first for, or don't have a program where you provide housing but no supports and call it Housing First for Youth because it's not,
Mhm.
right? So the core principles are key. Making sure there's housing and supports based on the needs and desires of the young person. Those are things you can't mess with. You got to follow the recipe. Like
Mhm.
if you're making a dish, you might want to alter this or that kind of thing, but you can't like go in another direction. You can't
Mhm. Mhm.
you can't make a sandwich and call it pizza. That's a bad metaphor.
You know what, Steve? I might actually quote you on that from now on, and you might regret it. Steve and I were actually at the Housing First Partners Conference a couple of weeks ago, and that's for those of you who know or don't know, that's Sam Simbaras's conference that he has every second year, and he was there, of course, welcoming everybody. And there was something that he said in his opening remarks, and Steve and I looked at each other when we heard this, and he said, "We can't expect the outcomes of Housing First for Youth when we don't support it properly." And I think,
Yeah,
like, it's like, if we want the evidence and the outcomes that are associated with Housing First for Youth, we actually have to staff it, implement it, and fund it in the
yeah,
way that it was designed and tested to be. And so, one of the things that Steve and I see a lot in fidelity reviews is people think that what we meant by, making it, adapting it. Steve said it beautifully. It's about your ecosystem and the culture and the community, but we didn't mean leave out core principle number 5 because you don't think you need it. You still need all 5 of those things. And then you can add your own, key ingredients in it, but you have to have those 5 things, or else
yeah.
you're not going to get the outcomes.
There's a story about Samson Barris that goes back about 8, maybe 10 years actually. Um, with Housing First, Sam's been clear you have to follow the recipe in that case too, with Housing First for adults. And a lot of his people who follow him really take that up as key, but they go farther than Sam would, right?
Mm.
That you can't change anything. It has to be exact. So Melanie Redmond and I were at a conference once, and Sam walks by and he says, I want to talk to you too later. And we thought, oh, he's going to come and say, don't what's this Housing First for Youth thing? You adapt it and turn it Housing First into Housing First for Youth. So he came back and met up with us and he said, I just want to tell you that I love the Housing First for Youth piece. This is Housing First 2.0. This is exactly what we need to do is adapt it to the needs of other subpopulations, but adapt it in a way that does not jeopardize the model itself and turn it into something else. It's okay to have other program models,
Yes,
but we shouldn't call things Housing First or Housing First for Youth if they're not, right?
that's a
That
really good point. Yes.
Yeah, that's great, Steve. And I think it segues nicely into a follow-up question about how do you do this work in a culturally community-specific way? How does equity show up in the work?
Mm.
it's a really good question that applies to anything and everything we do. So we have to understand, the intersectional nature of youth and their experiences. Many people will experience public systems in ways that are shaped by their identity. So we live in a society where we're still dealing with racism, we're still dealing with homophobia, we're still dealing with transphobia.
Mhm.
Indigenous people are still winding up going into hospitals and being mistreated. And so it's important to understand that as part of a person's history.
Mhm.
But it's also important to make sure that we don't participate in making those matters worse by pretending that difference doesn't matter, by pretending
Mhm.
that cultural positionality doesn't have an impact. And so you need to, this comes down to things like, what is the right staff person, the right case manager? What are the competencies they must have? What are the values of the organization doing the work? And who should be in control of the program? With
Mhm.
the very first Indigenous Housing First for Youth program came from Boys and Girls Clubs of Calgary. During our demonstration project, we worked with in Hamilton um, with a number of partners to design and implement a Housing First for Indigenous youth um, program model. And what we did is we turned it over to the community partners to own it, to develop it and run it. And so
Mhm.
they created this beautiful intervention. They had key partners like Kim Kakakaway from Away Home Canada. They designed it. They kept the core principles, but they elevated
Mhm.
things like seven grandfather teaching, and other indigenous ways of knowing. The project was steeped in ceremony and the role of adults, elders, I should say. And the research was based on indigenous approaches to
Mhm.
research, which included a lot of storytelling. And
Mhm.
so that was a great experiment. Indigenous-led Housing First for Youth program. We need more of those. You can do that anywhere in Canada. It's going to look different. And here's another case where the ecosystem matters. There isn't one Indigenous community in the country. There's many, and the
Mhm.
the cultural knowledge is both generalized but also very specific to where one is at. And so that's a kind of experimentation that we should consider. Um, why can't we have Housing First for Youth program that's for Black youth, that's led by Black community
Mhm.
members, that kind of thing. So
Mhm.
down the road, that's what we'd like to see. There's no reason you can't adapt these things to meet the special needs of different subpopulations. In fact, we should be doing that.
Mhm. We also, Wood Green in Toronto had a Housing First for Youth program for young people leaving care. Because one of the things that we obviously learned was that young people leaving care are some of our most vulnerable young people because they don't have knowledge or understanding of streets or any of those resources. And so we had to adapt how and who supported those young people. And then again, another shout out to Trellis in Calgary has the Aura program that specializes, it's Housing First for Youth, for young people within the 2S LGBTQ population. And again, five core principles remain, but the housing that is offered is often very different. They don't necessarily move right to a scattered site. They use more host homes and more communal living to help build up those communities because that's something that those young people have sought out and said that is important to them. So I think, Steve, those are really great. I think those are really great examples. One of the things that we do in our trainings is we talk a lot about culture and community, and there's so much culture in just the ways that any of us grew up
Yeah.
in our family homes or our caretaker homes. Like, did you watch Disney on Sunday? I probably just dated myself there, but did you get to watch Sunday Disney with eating dinner in front of the TV? Did you order pizza on Friday night? What did cultural traditions look like? And so, really thinking about culture and community, not just as populations of individuals, but what did it look like in those homes? And how do we try to honor that for young people and their people? So,
That's really lovely, and it's a nice segue to, helping communities think about what they need to do housing first for youth well. And I bet people on the call are wondering, why aren't there more housing first for youth programs? We know housing first for youth works. Why aren't there more options like this out there?
That's
Steph, yeah, before we go to that, I'm so sorry. I saw
Yeah.
somebody else ask a question that I didn't answer. And so somebody had said, I was just wondering if the number of shelters went down in the areas where Housing First for Youth got implemented in the case of Calgary. And I'm really excited to say, actually, yes. So Calgary now only has one youth shelter with a maximum of 25 beds, I believe. And so when we did implement it properly, we were able to close two of the youth shelters. So again, we know that, yeah, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but we're here to support you because we know it works.
yeah, and
But great question. Sorry. Thank you
that
for
is
that. And I'm sorry that I missed it.
that's a good one. And in terms of why there aren't more, that's something that we spent a lot of time thinking about. And
Mhm.
a couple of years ago at this conference, Dennis Culhane, who'd be likely the leading researcher on homelessness in the world, right? He said, "No problem isn't that we're not good at innovation. We know how to innovate and create good programs, but the real problem is we're not very good at taking innovation to scale. And it is a problem, and there's all kinds of factors that get in the way. And in Canada, it may surprise you to know that of all communities that have some kind of homelessness service, only 17% have any kind of youth homelessness service, right? So that means that like 83% of communities in Canada, there's nothing for homeless youth. So that makes it hard to implement housing first because there's no kind of established set of community organizations that could take it up. I think that the other thing is there needs to be dedicated funding for youth
Yeah.
homelessness pieces. I think this, and it can't just be folded in or at the whim of a community entity or that kind of thing. We need to like invest in things that are going to help young people, and we've got the evidence, right? Like this works. This like the evidence shows that this works. It's not just from our research. There's other research. Um, Marit Kurz published an article just
Mhm.
recently about housing first for youth in Kelowna and how effective it is at stabilizing housing, that kind of thing. But there's a lot of competition around the funding that goes to
Yeah.
homelessness, and if you don't have any kind of established youth advocacy, now I would not be recommending that those 83 communities all start building emergency shelters for
Good for you.
youth,
Yes.
you know. But what they could do is housing first for youth or family and
Hmm.
natural supports, that kind of thing. And so we're working on it. One of the interesting ways uh, that led to the scaling of housing first in for youth in Europe faster than Canada was this. They have these annual youth study sessions, youth homelessness study sessions by Fianza. Don't need to say what that acronym stands for because I won't be able to tell you. But anyway, it's a pan-European organization. So how it works is they'll have like a 1 week study session on a topic. And it's a residential program, so you're there for 5 days. You do all kinds of activities. You're there with like people from 20 different places. And the first time we did Housing First for Youth at one of those study sessions, it was 2015. There were 3 people at that session out of 30 who went back to their country and they convinced their bosses that they should implement Housing First for Youth, right? So it meant that in Scotland, in Ireland, and in the Netherlands, they had Housing First for Youth programs up within a year. I think something like that would be great in Canada if we're able to do that, like an intensive kind of, invest, program like that. But we need, when you talk to we've done research on, just talking with people in the youth homelessness sector, and they generally are very enthusiastic about prevention, very enthusiastic about housing first for youth, enthusiastic about family and natural supports, but they identify the barriers as being the community isn't always with them, right?
Hmm.
They also say that they aren't quite sure. They like the idea, but they're not sure where to start. They
Yeah.
all mention the need for, funding that is targeted, and they said we need good training and technical assistance.
Hmm.
So those are all very reasonable things that get in the way of doing something new, but they're all things we can deal with, right? And so we need to make sure we can advocate more for uh, funding for evidence-based prevention for youth, but we need to help communities. Away Home Canada has amazing training on these interventions that can, fit any kind of frame that you're working on. So the training is important. So like an event where you go do a deep dive, where you kind of work on like what is the kind of youth worker and family worker do you need to do this work and really kind of get those kind of people going. There is training and technical assistance. There's funding out there. There is money out there. But the
Yeah.
problem is that we're kind of in a bind with the growth in homelessness over the last 5 years. So a lot of the spending, I think, goes to crisis services rather than doing innovative things with youth. But we should never let go of that. And
Mhm.
just for everyone on the call, um, it's important to know that right now, government of Canada is reviewing the Reaching Home program because it expires in 2028. And it's an opportunity for them to look at what they've done, what's been successful. They're very interested to find out from people what people's opinion or feeling is about how successful it's been and what it should look like going forward. So when you see any opportunities to speak to people in government, either elected officials or public servants, talk about the need to go down the road of preventing youth homelessness. Canada
Yeah.
could become a leader very fast and make a big impact. So,
Hmm.
and if you're interested in finding out more about that, like just contact us. And this isn't like working behind their backs or anything. In fact, I know the people involved in Reaching Home really welcome input. They really, really welcome it. So, like writing a letter, phone call, message, your local MP, talk about why we need it. we're developing some resources that are going to be helpful for communities to do that kind of work, but we can't release it yet. Right, Steph?
Yeah.
Coming soon.
Coming soon.
I think I just wanted to follow. I know that we have lots of questions, and I'm like, oh, Nicole, you're here. Shannon, it's so great to see everybody. I know. I was like, it's kind of like we're just having coffee with each other in the morning. Steve, you had such a good idea that we were just gonna bring 100 of our closest friends together to just spend the morning together on a Thursday. I love it.
Yes.
Um, One of the things I wanted to say is when we talk about training, I think that I want to share with all of you is that we're not talking necessarily about, hey, let's just get together for 2 days and learn some stuff. Our training really looks different. If you're thinking, like going back to Steve's point, if you're thinking about wanting to get started, or you're not sure how to, or you're like, this is massive change management, all of those things are true. But we also know that what it takes, and we're not suggesting we're experts in everybody's community, but when we started implementing Housing First for Youth way back when, we actually sat in an office together. The director, the manager, and the frontline staff sat together every single day, and we needed to hold each other accountable that
Mhm.
every decision that we made, every time that one of those ideas around consequencing young people crept up, or our old ways of thinking, every single level of individuals was like, wait a second, does that fall in line with those five core principles? Is this our new way of thinking? How does this? And so don't feel ashamed, don't feel embarrassed that you're going to need like support. Some of my most favorite work that I do is show up as a thinking partner for individuals. Nicole is a really beautiful example. I can't even tell you how many times I've spent with calls with Nicole where Nicole's like, wait a second, what about this? What about this? Those sometimes are 5 minute calls. They can be 1 hour calls, but that's actually how we get traction on the proper interventions and prevention models for young people, is like coming together as a community. Erica's on this call. We have tons of community of practices. We're starting up our youth housing one again in the fall. If you're interested, get in contact with us. We have lots of research. Steve is very modest and didn't say some of the greatest and the most youth housing and youth prevention and youth homelessness research is happening here in Canada at the COH, which Steve
That's right.
oversees and leads. And so there's no bigger body of evidence than right here in our country. And so if you want to have a call, let's, have a call, because it's much more than just 2 days of training. Mandy, who leads Fearlessly in Sudbury, Ontario, is also on this call. And it's literally about constantly having phone calls or webinars and doing check-ins, because 2 days of training, we're all going to get back to our emails and go, wow, that was such a great 2 days, but I forgot everything I learned because the crisis exists. And so thinking bigger than just those 2 days. Yeah. Anyways, just wanted to share that with you. It's so much more. And reach out. Don't be afraid to reach out 100 times. That's what we're here for. Okay, we had some questions, Steve.
Yes, that's right. I see a
And
comment
so,
from,
yeah.
uh,
And we also have to read out the questions, Steve, because I forgot.
oh yeah.
And Lindsay had to send me a private message, and that's embarrassing. But Lindsay has to send me a private message being like, people don't know what you're talking about, Heidi. You're just having a conversation by yourself. Okay, so Steve Arnett, it's lovely to hear from you, Steve. Was the longitudinal period of follow-up, typically in terms of long-term trajectory evidence outcomes for youth in adulthood in the programs in Canada and beyond? Steve Gaetz, you're our guru when it comes to research. But the one thing that I'm thinking of when I read this, and I don't know if this is true, is the work that we did in Ottawa with the Aftercare
Yeah.
project. Am I thinking about this correctly?
That's what kind of popped up in my
Okay.
mind.
So Steve Arnett, I know that this isn't, I'm just going to use your last name so you know, don't think I'm talking to Gates. Steve, one of the things that we did, and it's not a huge number, so I recognize that, but the only piece that I can think about is longitudinal, is something that we did. So when we had the Making the Shift demonstration projects for those 7 years, some of those years were the hard years during COVID. One of the projects, the Housing First for Youth projects, actually closed up in Ottawa, but we had an opportunity and we took it with 16 young people and we followed them for 3 years after they left the Housing First for Youth program. So they discharged, exited, graduated, whatever language is appropriate to use for your community. And then we continued to follow up with research, but also, having lunch with them, implementing family natural supports and doing light touch case management, if you will, for 3 years after. Of those 16 youth, none of them actually ever entered into emergency services again. And those young people continued to meet with us on a monthly basis and were able to update because at that point, Steve, nobody actually knew what was happening after a Housing First for Youth program. And so this is the only one that I can think of worldwide. If somebody else has information, please share that with us about what happens after Housing First for Youth. We can go into detail. We don't have a ton of time today, but we had some huge lessons learned when we sat with those young people. I had an opportunity to sit with them, have lunch, have dinner in some focus groups. Some of them were really embarrassing moments for me, if I'm being super honest, because young people said to us, with a full transparency and a lot of vulnerability, you didn't do the best job that you could have. You didn't hit those 5 core principles, I think, the way that you were intended. And so we've done a lot of work within our TTA. Any of the writings that Steve and I do in the program model guides or operation manuals, we've really taken that youth voice and tried to shape it from what we've learned. One of the things that sticks out for me, and it never goes anywhere, so lots of you have heard this, is young people said we didn't focus on the 5th core principle enough.
Yeah.
We did not help them reconnect or build new relationships with family natural supports or new family or natural supports. And we did not focus on community connection enough because young people said, when I exited the program, the distress center or 911 shouldn't be my emergency call at 2 a.m. in the morning. And
Right.
so you could probably do a better job there. And so anyways, yeah, Steve, if you would like to see more information from that, Steve's Gaetz and the research team over at the COH has got 12-month and 24-month research around Housing First for Youth, and what that looks like. And so there is some small pieces, not enough, of course. But yeah, there is some. Steve Gaetz, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah. So we have 36 months of data on Housing First for Youth. Um, the There is other kinds of longitudinal research that is really promising. So Ron Kneebone, who's an economist at University of Calgary, linked homelessness data, so they're the HMIS system in Calgary, with health data and with police data. And so they were able to identify from
Mm.
the HMIS young people who had been in Housing First programs or Housing First like programs in Calgary. And they were then able to see what happens after, right? Like how many return to homelessness. And what they found is that the housing programs, like the Housing First for Youth programs, had a tremendously positive impact on housing stabilization post-program. Um, right? And so that kind of research where, it's called linking administrative data, from different systems. You connect them, you can hide who the name of the person is, so there's no like personal information, but you can go backward in time and forward in time to see what happens to somebody in their life. Like what are the outcomes for our programs for working with young people, and The outcomes are really quite amazing. And so we look forward to more of that. I'm going to go sideways for 1 second here now that I'm talking about research. There's a uh, PhD thesis that was just recently released where the student was able to get data from Veterans Affairs in the United States and identify which veterans had received housing first and which had
Mm,
received treatment first, which is a new wave of like we have to like force people into treatment, this kind of stuff. Had a
yeah,
sample of 300,000 people, right? So it's a huge study and looked at the long-term outcomes for them. And so for the people who received housing first, there were improvements in housing stabilization, improvements in health. For those who got treatment first, there were no long-term positive outcomes at all, right? And so
yeah.
the potential for research to really answer those questions and look at the long term is we're just at the start, but and looking forward to doing that. And we're working on a project that we're hoping is going to be able to turn into something like that where we can track people and see, what
Mhm.
happened next.
I just pulled up some of your research, Steve Gaetz and Ahmed, around the 24 months of Housing First for Youth participants. And one of the things, Steve Arnett, that we can share with you, and again, we have this in greater detail, but after 24 months, 84% of the young people that were in Housing First for Youth remain stably housed compared to the 48% of young people who were in treatment as usual. So it is very significant around, um, yeah, it's really significant around how much of a difference there
The
is.
and there some of the other outcomes were like surprising, right? So
Yeah,
improvement in mental health. You saw gains there where you didn't really see them amongst the treatment as usual. Important relationships with family and other people, improvements, y- lots of things like this. And one of the papers that came out of this work looked at young people uh, receiving housing first versus those who weren't, and looking at things like goal setting and that kind of thing. Because most people have goals in life of one kind
yeah,
or another. And what they found with the study, and this came from qualitative interviews with young people, is that when young people are in the Housing First program, they started to make plans to address those things they wanted to have happen. Like, I want to go back to
yeah.
school, that kind of thing. And then made the move, right? And so you had these improvements where people actualized their dreams. The
Hmm.
treatment as usual group didn't, by and large, right? Like because the day-to-day, it's the stuff that we know. Like when you're in a situation of homelessness, you're not thinking long term. You're thinking about where am I going to be tonight? What am I going to eat? Am I going to eat? That kind of thing. The focus is on the immediate. So there's the evidence is very compelling on in
Hmm.
terms of what Housing First can do.
Thank you, Fernanda, for sharing that. Steve and I were just reading Sydney's work. There's two pieces that have just recently been published, and it's absolutely incredible. So thank you for sharing that with everyone. And also shout out to Laura Campbell. Laura, I don't know if I've ever met you, but it's lovely that you're here. And I really loved, I'm going to send this out to Erica from who oversees all of our community practices around this tobacco prevention and public health piece, and the correlation between some of the, research that's happened there. And I'm going to share this with Steve as well, too. Steve, somebody privately wanted to let you know that you're such an amazing leader. So I just thought I would share that with you. Didn't want that to go quietly there for you. So yeah.
Well, thank you.
I know they're very sweet, these individuals here. Honestly, Steve is a pretty great dude. I've had the opportunity to work with him since 2009, and I've learned a few things from him. So I'm pretty
And
excited
I've
about
learned a lot of things from you. So
that. um, Steph, Steve and I have totally taken this over. We're not even following your
This is
questions.
great. You don't
We're
even
just
need
like,
me.
I know, I was like, we're answering everybody's questions.
I love it.
Like show of hands, does this format work for people? Clap, celebrate for us because this is the first time we've ever done this like fireside chat.
Oh,
It
look
was
at this.
Steve's like, okay, Steve, look
Look
at
at all
you
the
were
thumbs
right.
up.
Wow.
People
Very
wanted to
cool.
do this, Steve. Yeah,
Mhm.
this is really
More
great.
fireside chats, except with a real fireside.
Right, totally.
That's
Yeah,
the
we're
goal.
hoping at the next MTS conference that Steve and I can actually have a fake fire place with some chairs and do a fireside chat. That's really what our dream is. So yeah. Okay. Look at everybody's even like congratulating everybody on their work done in the communities.
Yeah.
Steph, Mandy has got their Youth Homelessness Prevention Steering Committee launching. Nicole, you said, how do other agencies navigate the core principle of housing first versus the restrictions involved with funding contracts? We have the base funding to staff, uh, but ours is in the same as the adult shelters, and they seem resistant to recognize that youth are different. That
Right.
is a that is a big one. Um that is a big one. And I think I need some time to think about that one through. Steve, I don't know if you have an immediate answer to that one.
Yeah, we have to. That's a really common problem,
Yeah.
right? And it's why we keep taking adult programs and just like change the age mandate and have homeless junior. Like,
Yeah.
why would we imagine that a 14-year-old in school needs help and support and has needs that are unique to their age group? People understand that there's a thing called adolescent development.
Yeah.
People understand that young people need to learn and take chances and they need meaningful adults in their lives. And so why would we assume that a young person who's homeless doesn't have that? They're suddenly not a youth anymore. They're like pushed into adulthood at a very early age. So in terms of dealing with it, that's a tough one. But there's lots of good data out there that's helpful. And I mentioned before, like stay tuned because we're going to have documents like why you should care about youth homelessness that kind of looks at what the data says
Yeah.
and that kind of thing. And we want to make it useful for people so that they can engage. I mean, in Canada, uh, with the government of Canada's data, they found in a point in time count that almost 50% of all currently homeless people, not just youth, but of all ages, almost 50% had their first experience before they're 25, right? So it's
Hmm.
like chronic homelessness, the pathway starts at a young age,
Hmm.
right? And um, in Canada, 40% of currently homeless youth had the first experience before they're 16. And in most communities, we have nothing for them, right?
One of
And
the things
so,
that we've also tried too is that we've actually been starting to do some family natural supports training within the adult sector to
right.
test it because that was a miss in the adult sector. And Nicole, one of the things that we've learned from those adults, so Steve's point about research, but also sitting with some of those adults that now are 40 and 50 are saying, actually, I was in foster care or I was in children's services when I was younger and I ran away at the age of 15 and I've been accessing emergency services or housing supports and I'm now 50. And so like those adults used to be our kiddos where we didn't do enough even because we didn't have the housing first for youth model or any of those prevention pieces or the three levels of prevention that Steve talked about. I also think I don't want to come off sounding like a smartass when I say this, but one of the things that Steve and I have said is we don't actually put adults in youth shelters or in youth programs. And so why do we think about putting
Yeah.
youth in adult programs? Like, and again, it's something that it's like we don't do that the opposite way. So why are we just throwing young people into those? Steve knows this about me. Some of you know this about me is that and Nicole, we can definitely take this call with Erica to our youth housing COP because I think this would be a good conversation to
Yeah,
hash out for
absolutely.
just an hour alone. But I like to walk the line of this where it's like, we'll take your funding and we'll make it work within our five core principles. And so I think there's a way that you can receive the funding, but also walk the line of making sure that you're adhering to the funding structure, but also doing the right work. So let's have that conversation on a bigger level for sure.
That's a great idea. The one thing, like every community is interested in addressing chronic homelessness. And
Mm-hmm.
I kind of feel like we need to have a conversation about why there are chronically homeless people because I feel like we make people wait, right? You're not homeless
Yeah.
enough, you're not sick enough, to receive housing first, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think with youth homelessness, because we're not enabled to address the problem in the way we want to in many cases, right? There's no funding or programs. Again, go back to the 83% of communities with no youth services. Um, because of that, we're making young people wait,
Yeah.
right? Like if you're 14 and there's no homeless services, you got to wait till you're 16. A lot can happen in
Right.
those 2 years. And
Totally.
so if we want to address chronic homelessness, what if we thought about it this way? If we do a good job of preventing a young person's homelessness, not only will we improve the outcomes for that young person, we'll likely improve outcomes for their family and for their community. But the
Mm-hmm.
big thing that we might do is turn off the tap into chronicity because, the federal data shows like between using different methods, between 58% and 74% of currently homeless youth are already chronically homeless.
Yeah.
It just blows my mind that we aren't enabled to stop that from happening. Like
Right.
that's a scandal that we'd let a young person fall into chronicity at that age. And this isn't a critique of of people doing the work with young people. It's a critique of how we respond to homelessness
Yeah.
and how we create priorities that are basically making people wait for help. Nobody should have to wait. We have to do everything we can to make young people not homeless.
Steve and I are pretty passionate about not ever using the word chronicity with young people. They have not been alive long enough to be chronic anything. At 16, no matter how much alcohol or narcotics or fun they've had on a Friday night, their body is much different than somebody who is of 60 years of age. And so they haven't been alive long enough to be chronic. And so we have, Steve will always say, we have an opportunity to do differently. And we have the evidence and we have the means to be able to do it differently. So Salvador, or sorry, Fernanda, I just want to say thank you. I don't know what time it is in Brazil, but thank you for holding the torch and coming and being a young researcher who's studying housing first. It is so cool that you stayed up or got up early to join us. That is awesome. And if we're ever in Brazil, we're going to make sure to come and see you. That is so great. And Steve Arnett, your comment and love that you shared with everybody around being firekeepers. That's really beautiful. I took a picture of that because your language is really gorgeous. So thank you for saying those kind words. That was very nice.
Um, Amber Rose has a question.
Oh, Amber. Great.
So, for youth that struggle with concurrent disorders, mental health, and substance use disorders, what do models of mental health and addictions supportive housing look like? This is an integral part of the adult housing continuum. Does
Mm,
that feel the same for the youth sector? It should be, right? And I want to point you to a really good model that you can have a look at, which is amazing. It's called HOP-C, so HOP dash C,
mhm.
and it's a housing first for youth like program, but focuses exactly on the population you're talking about. The person who developed it is Sean Kidd, who's like, if you've never met him, he's an amazing researcher, a community person. He and his team developed Hop C. They've adapted it for Indigenous youth, and they're hoping to expand it. And so it's all there on what to do if you were to contact Sean. So KIDD. And we have some resources on the hub about Hop C if you wanted
Yes.
to see how it works, right?
Yeah.
And so it's been validated, it's been tested. I highly recommend it.
Also tested in Nicaragua for
Is
those
that? Oh
who, because
yeah,
Shamara Campbell Richards, Steve, is joining us from London, the UK. We literally just came back, Shamara, from doing Housing First for Youth and Family Natural Supports training in the UK for 3 weeks. And so we're so sad that we did not see you. But we would love to stay connected because Steve, Melanie, and myself, we are often over across the pond offering trainings. And so that is not something that is not doable. And we jump on calls all the time with folks. So please stay in touch because we are here to support you. And we've got great colleagues in the UK that we work with very closely. I think also one of the things that I would say was it Amber? Did you say, Steve, about the mental health and
yes,
addictions?
Amber Rose.
Um, Amber Rose. One of the things that we learned from the aftercare, so the what happens after Housing First for Youth, is that young people actually shared with us is that they were not necessarily ready for therapeutic supports at the time that they were in the Housing First for Youth program. So the average length of stay for those young people were 3 years within that program, but they said they really needed to focus on their flight or fight responses and really settling their internal structure. And so one of the things that we saw with those 16 young people is that every single one of them was interested in traditional therapeutic supports later on, that they weren't willing to do or ready to do that work at 16 or 17. And when I think back on my own personal journey, I might not have been ready to do that at 16 either. And so just because young people might not be engaging, I think it's important, like Steve said, to offer it. But that might be something that comes when they're 25 or they're 30. But just making sure that the opportunity is there. The other thing that young people shared with us is that traditional therapeutic approaches is not something that they're always necessarily interested in. That they don't maybe want somebody who is of clinical backgrounds, that they want more of a Nicole or they want more of a Sarah for somebody to talk to. And so I just keep that, it's a generalization, of course, but just keep that in mind for you that if young people say no, it might not be the right time, but keeping that door open and remembering that the supports that you are offering are planting seeds and doing well for what they need
Yeah,
at that time.
and a key point is that all young people, all adults have the right to change their mind.
Yes.
Now I mentioned earlier a new article on Housing First for Youth in Kelowna, and somebody wanted the reference to it. So I'm going to read out the title, and then we'll also put that in the package. So the lead author on the team is Marit Kirst, so Marittkirst, and um, the article is called Understanding the Impact of an Integrated Housing First Mental Health and Addiction Service Model for Youth Experiencing Homelessness and Concurrent Disorders. Early Findings at 12 Months. So we'll make sure that article um, that we get that. Lindsay, did that you catch that, or did I just like talk really fast? Like I've had 5 coffees, which
Got it.
Honestly, we have Lindsay, Steph, and Erica. Like, we couldn't have loaded this call better with making sure that the three people that will keep us more organized, Steve, are going to make sure that everybody has everything you and I are talking about. Seriously.
good.
Mandy, I want to talk about your coordinated access and built for zero overarching coordinated definitions of homelessness, but I think we need a part two. for that conversation, because that was a conversation that I had yesterday. I think that you're right, and I think that young people actually need their own coordinated access and BNLs. I'm not here to pick a fight. I'm not here to get anybody upset, but coming from an organization, like my roots coming from Housing First for Youth in Calgary, they had, and I will give a shout out, because there's not a lot of great things that are happening in Alberta these days. But one of the things that did happen was we had our own youth coordinated access table and youth by name list. And that made a difference because when we were comparing young people to adults, their chronicity, their numbers, and I don't necessarily believe in numbers, but the system is what the system is. The young people were never reaching the top of the list because they weren't sick enough. And so we need to make sure that we're separating young people out. And so, Mandy, we should totally take that into a part two, or we should do conversations like that. The COH in A Way Home right now is working really closely with the CAH and the Homelessness Reduction Innovation Funds. They've got some youth programs that are going on right now. And so we're able to start sharing resources between COH and the CAH and A Way Home around definitions of youth homelessness, and the importance of youth by name lists and youth coordinated access. So stay tuned, hopefully. But yes, I think that you are absolutely, absolutely correct. And thank you, Amber, for your question. And thanks, Steph, for aw, Deb G, I don't know if I'm saying your name correctly. It's a lovely name, but thank you for your kindness and saying, um, yes, I realized it was a direct message and I'm going to get in trouble now
It's okay.
from
It's
I
okay.
was like, I'm going to get in trouble again from Steph and Lindsay for reading out, just reading the message for myself.
It's okay.
But yeah, thank you. It says, thank you for you and your team for this work. I particularly like the incorporation of a public health prevention perspective. The importance of recognizing the ecological factors as well cannot be overlooked. This topic is so personal of interest to me, and it warms my heart to see that others are passionate about this well. Thank you for all of your resources, your excellent resources, and kind regards to you all. Those that you just made my Thursday. Thank you so much for your kind words. We are passionate. We sometimes come off as aggressive, but it is really about assertive and hugging what we know to be true, because so much of our work since 2010 has truly been sitting with young people where they're in the depths of really being hurt, and listening to them and saying, please tell me what we need to do differently. Tell me what's going to work. And so I want folks to hear that this is really coming from a place of sitting with young people, sitting with their families in some of the darkest times when young people have unfortunately passed away, because that is the reality of some of this work. But listening and hearing. So thank you for hearing that passion. Merrick is here, Steve.
Yeah,
I
saw
don't know
that.
if you can see that, but it's so great to hear from you. Merrick is one of our greatest colleagues in Czechia. We have been connected in our work for years. Merrick, I don't know if you're going to Rotterdam in October, but we will see you there for a big hug. It will be exciting to talk about Housing First for Youth there. So I hope that you will be there. Lindsay has another one here. Oh, Shannon Berry. So lovely, Shannon. Wondering what methods have been successful in combating NIMBYism. We have had youth housing opportunities lost due to challenges with multiple zoning due to public pushback. That is a really great one. Shannon, that is a really difficult one. I can tell you from like a boots on the ground perspective, when I was a Housing First for Youth manager, this was probably one of my biggest pieces of work that I had to do. So I did a lot of neighborhood recognition. I also did a lot of neighbor like one-on-one support. I also had our MLAs involved. And I also did a landlord recognition, which Erica knows we can have this as a topic for our COP in the fall. But it was literally sending out thank you cards. It was literally bringing fresh baked cookies. It was literally putting young people in front of their neighbors to say, hi, my name is, and it's really great to meet you. It's really about bringing the community together to inform them, because one of the things that we learned around NIMBYism was that the individuals in those communities were actually scared. Our first housing, actual bricks and mortar housing, was in one of the most affluent communities in Calgary when we opened up Infinity. And it was a 12 unit apartment building. I thought we were crazy that we were going to house our most vulnerable young people coming directly out of Avenue 15 into this apartment building. We had cameras up, we had staff on site all the time, not as an office, but we were so scared about the garbage, about the loud noises. But one of the things that we did was we actually went knocking on our neighbors' doors, letting them know who we were, letting them know how we were supportive. I literally baked cookies. If you know me, I love to bake. I baked cookies. I brought thank you cards. We dropped off potted plants and flowers. We made sure that they heard the good things about the youth, because when the parties did happen on a Saturday night, they understood, oh, they're just 16-year-olds being 16-year-olds. We were all 16-year-olds once, and we're a little bit too loud. I had youth that used to throw their mattresses out in the back alley because they didn't want to have a bed in their rooms anymore. And I had neighbors call me and saying, your kids are throwing mattresses literally out of their apartment windows. Like, what is happening? Or their balconies, what is happening? And we would respond immediately. So it was really about also, cooking hot dogs and doing landlord recognition. When we did rent payments to landlords, we also threw in a Tim's card for $5 and said, have a coffee on us. We really appreciate your role in ending youth homelessness with young people. And so there was so much work to build up those relationships, because we knew if we invested every month, we would make it easy on ourselves. We started to see a trend where landlords were like, your kids are acting up again. We need you to come and talk to them, instead of going directly to a place of, you need to evict them. We're not dealing with this crap anymore, so on and so forth. So Erica, maybe we can talk more to give people like more ideas around how we can combat NIMBYism. But those are just some ideas to feel like we were able to answer your question and give you some ideas until we have another part two. So. I need to take a sip of water. I don't know where we're at.
Beverage break.
I know. I was like, what do we?
Yeah.
Oh, Steve, you really knocked this out of the park, Steve, because people are now asking for a part two of this conversation.
All right.
Yeah, so you really did well.
Well, we've been talking about this for a long time, so it's great.
Oh, Kendra, good question. I might have missed some, so I apologize if I have. Yell at us. Kendra, were there supportive services on site at the youth housing site? Kendra, I tried so hard to put them on site, and no, there was not. Um, we when we did scattered site, so I'll break it down for you a little bit. When we did scattered site, um, we had young people living in those apartments. We did have a resident manager. Now, I've done both. I've had a resident manager on site who was like somebody who knew the work. So they were trained as a youth worker, they were trained as a social worker, but they also had their own living unit. So they could, I'm just going to let you know some pieces that might be helpful to give you a visual, but they were allowed to have a partner. They were allowed to have guests over, this resident manager. They were allowed to have alcohol in their fridge. They were allowed to go out during the night, go to concerts. They were allowed to have, they were allowed to go camping for the weekend. So like a resident manager being, you're on site as much as possible, but you also go to work. Your whole job is not managing this apartment building because our Housing First for Youth workers would be at different times, they would be going and having those home visits with their young people in the different units. So we had a team of 10 Housing First for Youth workers. So at any given time, with those 12 youth in this one particular apartment building, they might have 4 or 5 different workers that are showing up every single week because they're going to meet their individual young people. So definitely can give you job descriptions if you're interested about those or like what that job looked like and entailed. But they were also there at 3 o'clock in the morning if there was a party to be able to come out into the hallway and say, you guys are being way too loud. Like we're gonna all get in trouble here, so calm it down, right? And so there was a level of support from a resident manager. Now, I've also done housing models in the community where we didn't have a resident manager on site. And so that's just really about making sure that we are on site and that we do have really strong relationships always with our community neighbors. But it depends on the needs of the youth. That particular program, I'll use the language lower acuity. I prefer complexity, but it's like more lower complexity for young people. So it also worked really well, but we also had staff offices on site when we didn't have young people live there. I think about protected or PSH for those of you who are, know that language, permanent supportive housing. One of the things that Sam Simbera says is with permanent supportive housing or like ACT teams, one of the things is around having the supports necessary for the individuals that are on site. We just want to remember young
Hmm.
people might not need that, right? They're not chronic, they're not very old. And so are we able to model what life would look like once us as professionals are not there? And so in a lot of transitional housing, Steve and I talk about this all the time. There's a lot of different housing models.
That's
Transitional
right.
housing can hold the housing first for youth philosophy with having staff on site. The difference is we want to make sure that young people don't get discharged and exited from transitional housing where there's usually the 24-hour staff on site. There's nothing wrong with having that, but make sure that we follow young people through to their most permanent housing that they're going to have once they're done those kind of support services like Housing First offers. Kendra,
That,
resident manager, more like a dorm college. Yeah, you could totally think about that. They got free internet. They had free room and board. So I guess not the board piece where it was the food. But I also brought them lots of flowers in vases to say thank you because like you're living with 12 beautiful adolescents who are figuring out how to be adults, but also leaving homelessness, not for the faint of heart. But yeah, Kendra, we can dive into it a lot more, but similar to that, yes.
Heidi, I just wanted to circle back. Merrick had a question around affordable housing. This comes up, I think, every time we talk about housing for
Right.
youth. And they ask questions about the political and public argument for housing first for youth in times of worsening housing affordability. When many young people cannot access independent housing, how do we defend the principle that young people experiencing homelessness should have access
Mhm.
to stable, independent housing? What is the strongest argument there?
I think that the question you raise is one that's probably um, found in many different places, right? That those
Mhm.
questions come up. The um, the the housing options for youth are quite variable, right? And
Mhm.
so it's really going to depend on what's available locally, right? For some young people, moving in with a family member is would work for them. But that won't
Yeah.
work for everyone, right? But in Canada, by the way, that is normative, right? For people between 21 and 31, about two-thirds live with family members. Young people in Canada often rent places with other people, right? They
Mhm.
don't have their own place. There's the transitional housing, but to Heidi's point, if you have a housing first program with the housing model being transitional, it has to have a component that's going to get people to housing. And
Hmm.
and so these are questions and points of resistance and ways of trying to render youth homelessness invisible that we all
Yeah.
struggle with. It's NIMBYism. Um, it's sometimes when I think about it, it's just like, who on earth would think that people shouldn't be allowed to have housing? Like it just boggles the mind that people think that,
Right. Or earn it. Why
or
are
earn
people
it.
having
Yeah,
to earn it? Like,
yeah, yeah,
um,
or be
yeah,
ready. I always love
yeah.
that. Be ready. Like,
You know,
what do you mean?
yeah, right. Steve, Lindsay, maybe in the part two, we should also break down for folks the difference between Housing First for Youth as a program and Housing First for Youth as a philosophy.
Right.
Because maybe, Steve, we need to help people understand that no matter what type of youth housing you're offering, you can adhere to a lot of these pieces, but how does
Yeah,
it look different when it's congregate care? And you can't think so much about the individual, but more about that group. Maybe we should add that
yeah, that would
into
be good.
a question. Okay, one of the things I was supposed to do because I realized we only had 4 minutes left and I'll get in trouble is a couple of things. For those of you who have stayed on, and that is the majority of you, so thank you so much for letting Steve and I ramble on for an hour and a half. Because some of you have had dinner and some of you woke up really early to be here with us. We have a youth housing prevention, or sorry, a youth housing call that's starting in September. Steph, I think you have a slide to show folks. Reach out to Erica or I if you want more information on that. So we have tactfully said it's not housing first for youth because we want everybody to feel included in this next youth housing because there's a lot of people that want to do housing first for youth but might have barriers, but we are going to help you figure out how you can get as close as possible within your community. And so we're going to start to take apart all of the youth housing so you can join us from wherever you are whenever you want to. So this is how to get in contact with us. Steve and I also have lots of different TTA supports.
Yeah,
There are free trainings on the Homeless Hub, Steve's baby, Lindsay's baby, Steph's baby. Please reach out to any of us. We can get you connected with a login, but they're free. They give you certificates if you need to put those into your human resources file. We also have a huge support of TTA supports, everything from showing up to your staff meetings, doing case consults, helping with the change management piece around, I want to do this. How do I get ready? How do I talk to my CEO? I am the CEO. How do we get started on Housing First for Youth? Do not feel bad. You need thinking partners and able to do this work. So please reach out to us. We're here for you. We do training across the globe. We do supports across the globe. Steve and I are often on webinars at 6 a.m. Canadian
that's right.
time, supporting Merrick and supporting people in the UK. So please do not feel bad and think that it's a barrier. It is not a barrier. And also, Lindsay made happen. I'm so excited. Steve and I are launching after a few years of working on this, coming directly from Community Ask. We are launching the Family and Natural Supports Operation Guide, which
Woo!
means it was years in the making. People asked for it. We did it. We are so excited to be launching that. I think, Lindsay, it's coming out next week. I hope. And
Out,
so
out already. I'll
it's
put a link.
out. Oh my
Yeah.
God. I missed it. I was like probably doing yard work.
Was there a
So
party?
I didn't have one, Steve. I think Lindsay and Steph had one. We were not invited. So our Family Natural Supports Model Operations Guide is out. It tells you how to do the work. Once you read it, connect with us and we will add on to those supports. Yeah, so we have free online training. We have everything. Please take us up on any of our offers. We are here for you.
That's right.
Amazing.
Um, Yeah.
And looking forward to the next fireside chat.
Steve, I think it needs to happen. Like a
That's right.
lot of people, almost everybody stayed on the call.
Yeah, yeah.
No, it's true.
So,
And I think,
yeah,
yeah, it's in the
and
works
Steph,
now,
I don't even think
officially.
we got through our questions stuff. We were so worried that nobody was going to actually come with questions, that we didn't even allow Steph to moderate or ask questions. So,
It was your fireside chat, and I think everyone loved the experience and they want to do it again. So we'll
There,
so
there's
got to
good
see what.
questions here, though. We're
they
going to
were
carry
really
some of
good
them.
questions. They
We'll
were
carry them
so
forward.
good.
So I'll hand it over to Heidi
Um,
here.
Steph, do you want to know something that happens now? Is Steve's going to see us in person, and because Steve is our boss, he's going to say, I told you that fireside chat that I've been talking about for 2 years is something that people wanted. And Steph, you and I are going to have to be like, you were right, Steve. That is exactly what people wanted. So, everybody,
Yeah,
we have your email addresses. Watch
stay
for the
tuned.
next Prevention Matters Part 2.
That's exactly right. And I know a lot of resources and a lot of great training content was mentioned today. We'll absolutely be following up with the recording and all of the links and downloads for you. So if you didn't keep track or didn't catch it all, you'll have it all in your email within the next couple days or next week at the latest.
Great.
But
Oh
that
yeah, and Steve Arnett, please come back to the part 2. Erica, can you please make sure that we've captured Steve Arnett's question around Build Canada Homes and CMHC, because Steve Gaetz will be able to speak about the COH and Away Homes work around how we're trying to look at an angle from the Build Canada Homes and the CMHA piece. So yes, Steve, we are looking at an angle for that. So please come back for that piece because we
Yeah,
have lots to share on
I'll
that.
just add one thing
Yeah,
about that, or a couple of things. One is
go for
contact
it.
Melanie Redmond because she's leading a national effort to put in an ask that would be for building youth-focused housing. And Sheldon Pollitt of Raising the Roof is involved in this as well.
Yeah,
So there's some opportunities there. Like right now, they're focusing on like large scale shovel-ready projects when the youth sector needs smaller. We don't need a 500 uh, room building. We need smaller amounts that can be dispersed amongst communities. So anyway,
right.
there's important stuff going on in that area, and if you're interested in it, we'll make a
Yeah.
connection.
If you are interested, Steve, I just put Melanie's and Steve Arnett. I just put Melanie's and my email. Feel free to email us, and I can give a heads up to Melanie if you're wanting to learn more about the CMHA connection and Built Canada Homes. And then also for folks that are still here, the wonderful, I will say, Dr. Steve Gaetz. So because we have a few Steves on the call, study session. Keep in contact with us because we're trying to figure out how we can offer the Canadian a week-long study session around housing
Yes,
first for
that's
you.
right.
So, Steve Gaetz is working effortlessly tirelessly on seeing if we can get funding to host
To
our
do,
own because it was a big deal in Europe. It is a big deal in Europe. And so we're hoping that we can figure out how to do something like that here in Canada.
woohoo! That's right.
Yeah.
thank you both. And thank you to everyone on the call. This is so exciting. This is probably our most engaging session to date. But that brings us to the end. I wish we could be on all day and just keep chatting. But next month, we have another session to look forward to. We'll be chatting with folks from Winnipeg on their work to bring duty to assist to the city and the
Yeah.
province of
Wow.
Manitoba. Yeah,
Yes.
so that'll be a good one not to be missed. We'll be sending out more information about that soon and how to register.
So good. And
And
Adam, just before we are also working on a project with Sean Kidd around Hop C, so we can talk about that in part 2 as well. Happy to share out those details and get you connected to Sean. And also, we do a ton of work with Washington State Building Changes, the Rakes Foundation. So please stay in touch. I actually think I'm headed to Washington State with Building Changes in the fall to do Housing First for Youth and FNS training. But we work really closely with Isaac at the State Department. So keep coming and showing up because we can also share what we're learning in Washington State. So yeah. Oh, cool! You're here. Youth homeless. Oh, yeah, the homelessness. Yay! Look at this. Oh, Mandy, also, Erica, if you can capture that, we also want to discuss how do we work with under 16s. Thank good. Look at Steve, everybody stayed on and we're late.
Yeah.
We're running over time.
Isn't anyone
Yes,
hungry?
I know. I was like, should we all have lunch together now? Oh, Aiden, look at you all. This is so great. OHY in the house. Can't wait.
Wow.
Yeah, this is awesome. Um, okay, we are all going to come back together. Rosemary, amazing. This is so fabulous. It's like our whole family is here. This is great. Okay, everybody,
Thank
we
you so much.
captured, yeah, we're here. We'll
Thanks,
do it again.
everyone.
This is great. Thank you. Thank you. We'll see you all again next month, and we'll be in touch with all of these resources very soon.
Okay, great.
Have a good
Take care,
afternoon, morning,
everybody.
wherever you
Bye.
are.